Hello. It's nice to see you. Happy Thursday. Happy chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Sota. I am going to be your host and teacher this morning. My name is Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning in a daily dose of Talmud. And I am excited to see you all. Lots of familiar faces, of course, especially if you're new. Please go ahead and introduce yourself, but tell us where you're coming from this morning, if it's morning for you, which it might not be. And I'm just giving everyone a sec to file in from the waiting room. I think we're all assembled, and we will go ahead and get started. Okay, I'm going to drop a link in the chat to my source sheet for this morning. Oh, hi from Connecticut, Rachel's iPad. I'm also Rachel, and I'm also in Connecticut. All right, I'm in New Haven. All right, so here is the source sheet, and I will share my screen in a minute. Sorry, just admitting people. A little bit of a dance here. All right, and we will get going. All right, so let me share my screen. It will be a little tricky for me to monitor comments while I do this, so please just bear that in mind. But please do keep introducing yourselves, and you can pop questions there if you like. I will come check on them in the end. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, I got a thumbs up. Thank you. Yes, you're all on forced mute. You can't answer verbally. All right. So, welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review. We're going to look back at the past week, April 27th to May 4th. Happy Star Wars Day to those who celebrate. And it's been a busy week in Tractate Sota. We have been in 3 different chapters. So let me take you quickly on a tour of the topics we have been through, and then I will tell you what we will focus on to discuss today. All right, let's start with chapter 5. Chapter 5 was a kind of grab bag of subjects. This was pages 27 to 31. And the common thread between them is that the Mishnah that governs this chapter tells us that these were things that were all taught on the same day. And the first item from Rabbi Akiva was about sota. So we learned that the bitter waters that the sota drinks doesn't just evaluate her, as you might imagine, because it enters her body, but it actually has an effect on the body of her suspected paramour as well, if they're guilty, right? And this is Rabbi Akiva. And also Rabbi Akiva says that before the sota undergoes the ritual, she's not only forbidden to her husband, but she's also forbidden to her paramour. You might be wondering, well, of course she's forbidden to him. She's married, but the rabbis are imagining, well, maybe her husband dies during this interval. Can she now marry him? And the answer is no, not until the sota has determined her innocence or guilt. Okay, and then there are a whole bunch of other teachings that happened on that day. That's what the Mishnah tells us. It was on that same day, including non-sacred food, meaning food that has not been marked out for temple use, can contract third-degree impurity, right? There are degrees of impurity. Something becomes impure and then it can infect, if you will, something else. So the first item has first-degree impurity and the second item has second-degree impurity. And the Torah makes clear that we can have this transmission, but the rabbis really expand the transmission beyond 1 or 2 degrees to 3 or 4. And what Rabbi Akiva argues here is that this third-degree impurity actually is by Torah law, not by rabbinic law. Really technical. We'll have a lot of time to discuss ritual impurity and contraction of impurity later on in our Daf Yomi journey. Also, Rabbi Akiva derives from 2 verses that seem to be in conflict with each other about the cities of the Levites, the territory that was granted to the Levites because they didn't have their own full territory. They had little bits of territory in cities. Anyway, from those 2 verses, he derives that the Shabbat limit of 2,000 cubits can be derived by Torah law. We also saw some non-halachic stuff in this chapter. We learned that the Song of the Sea, that the Israelites sang as they crossed through the Red Sea was sung in call and response, though there is some disagreement about exactly how that worked. And we also learned that Job served God, or if you remember the book of Job, that God, the man that was so righteous and God punished him just to prove that being punished wouldn't upset his righteous behavior, that Job served God not out of fear, but out of love. Okay, so that's why we had a whole grab bag of topics for those few pages, lots of interesting stuff we discussed in the essays, and they are in the Gemara. Okay, let's look back at chapter 6. I'm scrolling down now to chapter 6. This was a really fast chapter. It was only a page. I think we barely had time to really hit it in the series, but it's kind of an interesting chapter because it talks about cases where so if a woman commits adultery, if for sure she's guilty, like you have two really top-notch witnesses, impeccable witnesses, then what happens is she's stoned, right? She and the lover are stoned. That's the punishment. At the other end of the spectrum, we have enough suspicion that she undergoes the sota ritual, which will determine whether she's guilty or not. But this chapter outlines two intermediaries between those two, right? So on the one end, impeccable evidence, she's guilty, we stone her. On the other end, we really can't say, so we do the sota ritual. In between that, we might have enough evidence that we're pretty sure she's guilty. We're going to not go to the sota ritual, but not enough evidence to actually stone her. And so the intermediate position is a divorce is triggered. She must divorce her husband. And so this chapter outlines some of the cases, some of the kinds of evidence you might have that would take you to this intermediary position where she gets divorced. And in some cases, the evidence is such that she gets divorced, but she keeps her ketubah, right? An example of that is if you have only the testimony of another woman who hates her. Right? That's enough that we think she's probably guilty enough. We have enough evidence that she's guilty that we're going to trigger a divorce, but because that woman hates her, maybe we're a little more suspicious, so she gets to keep her ketubah. Whereas the testimony of a single witness, which is not really enough full testimony in a rabbinic court, that doesn't hate her, will trigger a divorce and she doesn't get to keep her ketubah. Okay, so that was a real quick chapter 6, about, like a case where we might not do sota and we might not do stoning, we might do something intermediary. We might force a divorce between these two people, with or without the ketubah, depending exactly on the nature of the evidence. And they give a couple of examples. All right, and then let's move, then by page 32, this was about 3 or 4 days ago now, we moved on to chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a longer chapter. We're only about a third of the way through so far. And chapter 7 is a grab bag of subjects too. But all of them are triggered again by a single Mishnah. And in this case, it's a Mishnah which it's a laundry list of things that you recite in Hebrew and things that you do not need to recite in Hebrew. So in other words, the Amidah, for instance, the Mishnah says you can recite in the vernacular, but other items you are required to recite in Hebrew. And the reason this list is brought here is because the first item is the sota ritual statements, right? The oath she takes at the temple. And I think also her husband's warning of her. Those things must be done in Hebrew. But there are lots of other things that this Mishnah brings, some of which we've already had a chance to discuss in some of the essays we've sent through, including what happened when Joshua entered the land of Israel and he assembled 6 tribes on one mountain, 6 tribes on the other, and started reading out the blessings and curses that were that he was assigned to in Deuteronomy, right? And also a very long discussion of the Birkat Kohanim, the priestly benediction, where the priests go up on the bima or in the temple. They sit originally in the temple and they make this sign that looks like a shin with their hands and they bless the congregation. Very, very powerful Jewish blessing in antiquity. And also, I don't think we've quite gotten here yet in where we are in the reading, but we'll get here very soon, how the king reads the Torah before the nations, also a requirement of the book of Deuteronomy. All right, so that's your orientation to what we did this week. And here's what I'd like to do for the rest of the class to dive a little bit deeper into some of this stuff. And I'm going to do something a little different than we've usually done before. I'm going to go way back to the beginning of this week to chapter 5, where it says these teachings were all taught on the same day. We're going to talk about what day that was, because it was quite an incredible and historic day in the minds of the rabbis. These words that are in the Mishnah that just say on the same day really don't convey how significant this day was. And we're actually going to go back to the rabbinic discussion of this day, which was actually all the way back in Tractate Brachot, right? If you have been on this Daf Yomi cycle since the beginning, you would have encountered this story, I think, about February 2020, right? It's Brachot 27, maybe the very end of January 2020. So it's been a while. It is one of the greatest stories, in my opinion, in rabbinic literature. It's quite long. And I think one of the fun things about Talmud that doesn't come out as much in Daf Yomi is how much it is all interconnected. So I'm going to take some license in this class and bring us all the way back to Brachot to enjoy that story, because it is just so iconic and so interesting and so well crafted. And then if we have a little time after that, we will also dive into the Mishnah that I mentioned that begins chapter 7 about what's recited in Hebrew and what's not, because I think that's just always kind of interesting for contemporary Jews, especially if we are in congregations where some things are recited in Hebrew, some things are recited in the vernacular. What did the rabbis think about reciting some of these things in Hebrew versus the vernacular, and why did they think those things? So if we have time, the story in Brachot is quite long, but I wanted to first, give you an orientation to everything we did. And yeah, let's move forward then. I will take a minute and check the chat, see if there's anything that needs response. Okay, nice greetings. Lots of interesting places people are coming from. Hello to the California crowd. I'm always impressed that you're here. Well done. All right, so let's go on then to discuss this beginning of chapter 5 that we encountered almost a week ago. Okay, here's a snippet of that Mishnah that opens chapter 5. So you can see exactly what it says about that day, because it says almost nothing, right? It says, just as the waters evaluate her, so too, I'm right here in this paragraph. Just as the water evaluates her, so too the water evaluates him, meaning the paramour. As it is stated, and then they bring 2 verses. The first one says, and the water causes the curse to enter into her. And then it says again, and the water causes the curse to enter into her and become bitter. And so this double enter, right? Enter into. This is, you can probably almost feel is going to be a Rabbi Akiva style. And in fact, we'll be told in a few minutes, it's Rabbi Akiva. He hears the two instances of enter, and he imagines, well, it has to actually enter 2 people. So it enters her and it enters her paramour, not physically, but in terms of its effect. Right. And then the teaching continues. And just as she is forbidden to her husband, so too she is forbidden to her paramour until the ritual is complete. Right. She can't sleep with either of them while we're waiting for the verdict of the Sota ritual. And here he again brings 2 verses. Numbers 5:14 says she is defiled, and Numbers 5:29 and is defiled. Right. Is defiled. And is defiled. Rabbi Akiva hones in on that extra vav, that the little conjunction that means and in the second verse, and understands that as a hint that she's not only defiled for her husband, but she's also defiled for the paramour. And here it is. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. And then the Mishnah says, and this is the phrase I wanted to focus on that same day, Rabbi Akiva interpreted, and then we get that whole list of other things that I discussed at the top of this class, right? All the other things that Rabbi Akiva taught on that day. And then there's, I think, also 1 or 2 from other rabbis. So it sounds really innocent, but they're actually talking about a very specific day. It is the day that Rabban Gamliel, who was at that time the head of the Sanhedrin, was deposed from his position because he behaved terribly. And so this is going to be a long story, but we're going to see if we can get through it. The things you should know about Rabban Gamliel is that he was the leader of the Jewish community shortly after the destruction of the temple, and he had all the right things. He had all the right education, all the money, all the connections. He was a very natural leader, but because of his who he was, but he was also not really known for being so nice. And in particular, he had a tendency to beat up on Rabbi Joshua. Here it's Rabbi Yoshua. And we have seen a couple of cases where he does this. And this is one of those stories where he just really goes after Rabbi Yoshua. So here's what happened on that day. The sages taught. There was an incident involving a student who came before Rabbi Yoshua. The student said to him, "Is the evening prayer optional or obligatory? Do I have to say Mariv?" And Rabbi Yoshua said to him, "Optional." The same student came before Rabban Gamliel and said to him, "Is the evening prayer optional or obligatory?" Right? This student hasn't learned, like my kids, that once you get a yes, you stop asking, right? So Rabban Gamliel says to him, obligatory. So now the student has asked Yoshua whether it's optional and Rabban Gamliel, and he's gotten different answers. The student says to Rabban Gamliel, "Hey, but didn't Rabbi Yoshua tell me that the evening prayer is optional?" Okay, now he's just stirring trouble. And Rabban Gamliel said to the student, "Wait until the masters of shields," meaning Torah scholars kind of doing battle, "enter the study hall." All right. So now, next scene, I'll change the paragraph. When the masters of the shields entered, the questioner stood before everyone present and asked, right? Gamliel's there, Yoshua's there, and he says, "Hey, is the evening prayer optional or obligatory?" Rabban Gamliel said to him, "It's obligatory." And then we don't hear anything else. And Rabban Gamliel speaks again. He said to the sages, "Is there any person who disputes this matter?" Right? Yoshua hasn't said anything. He's just keeping his own quiet, but Rabban Gamliel is pushing in for a fight here, I think. And even though Rabban Gamliel says explicitly, "Does anyone want to fight me on this?" Rabbi Yoshua says to him, "No, I don't. No one disputes you." And then Rabban Gamliel pushes it even further. He said to Yoshua, "But was it not your name that they told me that the evening prayer is optional?" Rabban Gamliel said to Rabbi Yoshua, "Yoshua, stand on your feet and they will testify against you." He's forcing a confrontation here, right? Even when he directly asks Yoshua, "Did you say this?" and Yoshua doesn't answer, he forces Yoshua to stand up and he asks for testimony about what he said. At this point, Rabbi Yoshua stood on his feet and said, "If I were alive and the student were dead, the living can contradict the dead, and I could deny that ruling. But now that I am alive and he is alive, how can the living contradict the living?" In other words, now there's a witness in the room that I said it. So I now you forced me to admit this. I've tried really hard not to admit it, but you have forced me to admit that I ruled differently from you, that I gave different answer to this question. All right. And Rabban Gamliel responds by leaving Yoshua on his feet, right? He's been forced to stand up, and Rabban Gamliel stays seated because he's the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, and now he starts lecturing. And Rabbi Yoshua was all the while standing on his feet, right? This is a humiliation that Gamliel is going to just sit and lecture and force Yoshua to stand there while he lectures, in punishment, presumably, for the alternate ruling. Until finally, this upsets the whole room, and all the people began murmuring and said to Chutzpit, the disseminator, who's basically Gamliel's microphone, right? He's projecting the lecture for Rabban Gamliel. They said, "Stop conveying Rabban Gamliel's lecture. Just stop." And they bring the proceedings to a halt. And he stopped. And they said, "How long will Rabban Gamliel continue afflicting him?" Meaning Rabbi Yoshua. "Last year on Rosh Hashanah, he afflicted him regarding the firstborn the story in Rosh Hashanah was very good. Beginning of Rosh Hashanah, we covered that also in Daf Yomi. Can't do everything today, but this is, like I said, this is a long-standing thing between these two, and Rabban Gamliel frequently picks on Rabbi Yoshua. regarding the firstborn in the incident of Rabbi Tzadok, he afflicted him. And here too, this is the third time we've seen it, he is afflicting him. Let us remove him from his position of Nasi. His picking on Rabbi Yeshua in this way so angers the crowd that they decide that even though he is the wealthiest, best connected, best educated in the room, he just isn't fit to lead. Okay, there's a complete coup against him. And so they remove Rabban Gamliel, and then they say, well, who should we put in his place? Should we put Rabbi Yeshua? Maybe Rabbi Yeshua should be the Nasi. And they say, no, we're not going to do that because he was a party to this incident that will taint his leadership. So then they suggest maybe Rabbi Akiva, also a great sage of that era. No, they don't want to do Rabbi Akiva because Rabban Gamliel would cause him to be divinely punished, and he lacks the merit of his ancestors to protect him because he was the descendant of converts. Let me explain what that means. Rabbi Akiva, according to some traditions in the Talmud, was the descendant of converts. And the rabbis have this idea that if somebody is, and we've seen this in other cases, we will see it in the story of the Avnei Machnai, also one of the most famous stories in the Talmud, that if somebody has a grudge and is aggrieved and they pray to God, they can actually cause physical harm to the person they're aggrieved against. And they're worried that what will happen is if they establish Rabbi Akiva in this position, Rabban Gamliel will be so bitter against Rabbi Akiva, he will prey on his grudge, as it were. You could use the word pray in both senses, P-R-A-Y and P-R-E-Y in that sense. And what will happen is that because Rabbi Akiva doesn't have the merit of really connected Jewish ancestors to protect him, that prayer will be harmful to him. So to protect Rabbi Akiva, they're not going to elevate him either. So who do they pick? Rather, they establish Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Who's this kid? He's a kid. He's wise. He's rich. Okay, those are good qualifications. And a 10th generation of Ezra, right? The scribe that helped assemble the Torah and was there when the Israelites came back and led the community when the Israelites came back from the first destruction of the temple. He is wise, so if Rabban Gamliel raises a challenge in a matter of Torah, he will be able to answer it. He's rich, so if the need arises to pay homage to the Caesar's court, if we have to pay off the government, he's going to be able to do that. And he's a 10th generation descendant of Ezra, so he has this amazing yichus, this merit of his ancestors, and so Rabban Gamliel will be unable to bring down harm on his head. Okay, so they decide they're going to appoint Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. They come and said to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, would you, the master, consent to be the head of the yeshiva? And he said to them, let me go consult with my household. Doesn't say yes right away. And what he means is he's going to go talk to his wife. He needs to go talk to her. So he went and talked to his wife. And she said to him, you know, this does not seem like a good job. Perhaps they will remove you from office just as they removed Rabban Gamliel, right? These guys like to depose people. I don't know. Do you want this job? It seems insecure. And he said to her, let a person use an expensive goblet one day and let it break tomorrow, right? That's clearly a proverb from or folk saying from this era, which basically means like, well, you know, take advantage of the opportunity when it comes and don't worry about whether or not it's going to last. And she has one more objection. She says, you do not have white hair. And that day, when he was 18 years old, a miracle transpired for him and 18 rows of his hair turned white. God gave him white hair so he would look the part. I've recently become aware, by the way, that some people actually dye a little bit of white into their hair to look more distinguished, to be more successful in various jobs. I recently learned about this phenomenon. I don't know how widespread it is. And anyway, here's an early incident of it. God gives him white hair, so he looks the part of the head of the Sanhedrin. And that explains that which Rabbi Elazar is remembered to have said, which is, I am as one who is 70 years old. And he did not say, I am 70 years old. I am as one who is 70 years old. All right, so Rabbi Elazar ben Gamliel is out, Elazar ben Azariah is in, and it was taught. On that day they dismissed the guard, and permission was granted to the students to enter. Apparently, Rabban Gamliel kept guards at his study house. And the first thing Elazar ben Azariah did was do away with the guards. As Rabban Gamliel would proclaim and say, any students whose insides are not like his outside will not enter the study hall. He was very particular about who he admitted as a student in his study hall. And on that day, several benches were added. Rabbi Yochanan said, Abba ben Yosef ben Dostai and the rabbis dispute this matter. One said 400 benches were added and one said 700 benches were added. But either way, we've suddenly admitted a lot more students to the study hall. And now the story is actually going to go tell us how Rabban Gamliel is feeling, which I think is really interesting. He's been kind of just a villain in this moment, but rabbinic texts are often more complicated, and he's not simply a villain. And we do care about how he feels. So the story pivots and says Rabban Gamliel was disheartened. He said, perhaps, heaven forbid, I prevented Israel from engaging in Torah study. He looks at what Rabbi Elazar Hazariah has done by opening up the study house and getting rid of the guards and putting in 400 or even 700 new benches. And he says, did I keep Torah from Israel? And he was shown in a dream white jugs filled with ashes, which is meant to suggest that these students, though they look good on the outside, are kind of insubstantial on the inside. In other words, it means that he didn't really make a mistake in turning those students away recently. And then, just as the Gemara often does, it gives us the other side of that. It says, actually, that is not the case. The dream was just shown to him to ease his mind. They weren't bad students necessarily, but he was shown that dream so that he could feel better. And it was taught. Eduyot, which is an entire tractate of the Mishnah that doesn't have Gemara, so we're not going to study it in the Daf Yomi cycle, but it's a really interesting tractate, and it's just a collection of all kinds of, Eduyot means testimonies, it's a collection of all kinds of sayings of the sages, sort of organized by personality instead of by subject. Eduyot, the whole tractate of Mishnah was taught on that day. They laid down a whole tractate of the Mishnah. And everywhere where they say on that day, it is referring to that day. Okay? So when our Mishnah, all the way in Sota, says on that day, it means this day. This is how we know. Because this story tells us whenever the rabbis say on that day, it was such a significant day, they just refer to it as on that day. It's referring to this day when there was a complete turnover of leadership in the study hall. There was a battle between scholars. It ended up with Rabban Gamliel being deposed and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah taking his place. But the story doesn't end there. There was no halacha whose ruling was pending in the study hall that they did not explain. They solved a lot of things on that day. They got a lot of work done. And even Rabban Gamliel did not avoid the study hall for even one moment. As we learned, on that day, Yehuda, the Ammonite convert, came before the study hall and he said to them, what is my legal status in terms of entering the congregation of Israel? In other words, can I, an Ammonite convert, marry a Jewish woman? Right? And we have a tradition that was decided that day. And who answers him? Rabban Gamliel. Clearly, Rabban Gamliel was there, right? Rabban Gamliel says no. Not surprising. That tends to be a stance on a lot of things, right? No, Yehuda, the Ammonite convert, are not permitted to enter the congregation. And Rabbi Yeshua, right? They're just at it again, right? Rabbi Yeshua says, no, you're permitted to enter the congregation. You can marry an Israelite, a Jewish woman. And Rabban Gamliel says to Rabbi Yeshua, hey, wasn't it already stated, an Ammonite and a Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to the 10th generation shall none of them enter into the congregation of the Lord forever, right? This is Deuteronomy's rule that you're not allowed to marry an Ammonite or a Moabite or even a descendant 10 generations on of a convert from these peoples. And Rabbi Yeshua said to Rabban Gamliel, yo, do Ammon and Moab really reside in their places today? Right? Are the Ammonite territory, are those really Ammonites anymore? The Moabite territory, are those really still Moabites? Like, it's been a long time since Deuteronomy. And he points out that Sennacherib, the Assyrian conqueror, already came and scrambled up all the nations when the Assyrians rolled through. And consequently, the current residents of Ammon and Moab are not really ethnic Ammonites and Moabites. And then he gives a citation in scripture about Sennacherib. I have removed the bounds of the peoples. I have robbed their treasures, and I have brought down as one mighty the inhabitants. There might be a typo there. Apologies. Okay, so they go back and forth and back and forth. I see we're tight on time, so I'm not going to do the whole thing, but basically they quote scripture back and forth to each other, and they decide in the end that Rabbi Yehoshua is right, not Rabban Gamliel, and they permit this convert from Ammonite territory to marry a Jewish woman. Let's just if you don't mind staying for a few minutes, we will wrap up with the end of this story, because it actually was kind of a happy ending. So Rabban Gamliel sees all this that is going on. He's still in the study hall. He's still participating in these discussions, but he's not heading in anymore. And he says, since this is the situation, right? People really like Rabbi Yeshua's rulings. I need to go and make it right with Rabbi Yehoshua. I need to appease him. So he goes to Rabbi Yeshua's house. And when he goes there, he sees that the walls of the house were black. Why? Because of Rabbi Yeshua's, because of his profession. He's a blacksmith. And Rabban Gamliel said to Rabbi Yehoshua in wonderment, from the walls of the house, it is apparent to me that you are a blacksmith. You actually work for a living. I had no idea. And you do dirty work too. And Rabbi Yehoshua said to him, woe unto a generation that you are its leaders. You are its leader, as you do not know the difficulties of your own Torah scholars, how they have to make a living and how they feed themselves. And then Rabban Gamliel offers a full apology. I insulted you. Forgive me. And Rabbi Yehoshua doesn't accept immediately. So he asks again. He says, do it in deference to my father. And then Rabbi Yehoshua accepts the apology. So now Rabban Gamliel has made things right with Rabbi Yehoshua. And now we need to question whether we still really want him to whether we want to reinstate him. It seems like it might be appropriate to reinstate him. So they said, who will go inform the sages that really Rabban Gamliel should go back to his position? And there's nobody wants to go tell them, worried about the response. So a launderer finally agrees. He goes, and he says, the one who wears the uniform will continue to wear the uniform, so that the one who did not wear the uniform will not say to the one who wears the uniform, remove your uniform and I will wear it. He gives a very launderer type, a little bit cryptic message there. He doesn't say it quite outright. He uses his language of clothing and says maybe the one who wears the uniform should be back in the uniform. And Rabbi Akiva, who seems to be holding down the fort at the study hall, said to the sages, lock the gates so Rabban Gamliel's servants don't come disturb the sages. He thinks this is some ploy on Rabban Gamliel's part. He doesn't buy it. And so then Rabbi Yehoshua comes himself. He says, it is best if I go. And he came and he knocked on the door. And then he gives another sort of elliptical way of saying this. He says, one who sprinkles pure water on those who are ritually impure, son of one who sprinkles water shall continue to sprinkle water. This is a reference to the sprinkling of the ashes of the red heifer and water to purify somebody who's reversed corpse impure. Anyway, in interest of time, we'll skip to the bottom. Rabbi Akiva looks at Rabbi Yehoshua after this whole discourse and says, have you been appeased? I'm down here. Everything we did was to defend your honor, Rabbi Yehoshua. And Rabbi Yehoshua says, yes, I've been appeased. So now the question is, well, what about Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah? Do we just take away his job, right? That's exactly what his wife said would happen, right? Do we just take away his job? And so the first thought is that maybe we should remove him, right? They said, what shall we do to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah? Maybe we should remove him. And then they say, no, because we have this principle that we elevate in sanctity, but we don't downgrade in sanctity. And that includes with our leadership. So then they decide we're going to have a rotation. One sage will lecture one week and one sage will lecture the other week. And then they say, no, that will cause too much jealousy. So rather we will let Rabban Gamliel lecture 3 weeks and let Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah lecture in 1 week. And we will do that kind of rotation. And that arrangement was adopted. And that is the explanation of the exchange in Tractate Chagiga. Whose week was it? It was the week of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. That's a comment that comes through in Chagiga. So really great story. Really see the sages going at each other and thinking through problems and being mean and then being kind and forgiving and reflective. It's a really rich story. probably worth more than half an hour. But that's the background to all those decisions that Rabbi Akiva pumped out in the Mishnah that begins chapter 5 of Tractate Sota. And that's why that chapter is such a grab bag. And so keep your ears out, because there are elsewhere you will discover on the page where the sages casually say on that day. And now when you encounter those words on that day, you will not think, oh, it was just some ordinary day. You will know that it was the day where the sages had one of the greatest disruptions in the house of study, because one sage humiliated another, and as a result was deposed, and the whole order of the study hall was changed. It was totally democratized, and then we had forgiveness, and then the first sage came back, but things were never the same afterward. So really great story. Glad I could share it with you. I hope you don't mind that I migrated us out of Sota a little bit, but everything in the Talmud is connected, and sometimes it's fun to just take a little detour. So I'm going to stop my screen share. We will close here. Let me just peek if there's anything else that requires response in the chat. Okay. All right. Okay, I don't see any immediate questions. Okay, I see a private message from somebody about who's having trouble getting the Daf Yomi emails. So I'm going to just publicly put my address down here. Let's move this over to email. And if anyone else is having technical troubles, I can help you there. So that's how you can reach me by email. Oh, we've got one question. All right, Carol. Can you come through? I clicked the unmute button for you. Still want to ask Carol? Technical problems?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we got you.
Okay, so that was fantastic, amazing. You covered so much and brought so many things together. My question is why, to whose advantage, the rabbis, the editors, is it to hold this idea that so much happened on one day? So my question is kind of the why. What power, meaning does that idea have that all of this happened on one day? Thank you.
Yeah, well, it was quite a day, right? We had Rabban Gamliel. It's really a study, I think, of Rabban Gamliel's use of power and the way he controlled the study house, and what happened when he went too far in sort of imperiously wielding his power, and he used it to really unnecessarily humiliate Rabbi Yoshua, right? Rabbi Yoshua ruled differently, but when challenged, he didn't want to contradict Rabban Gamliel. He wasn't trying to cause trouble, and Rabban Gamliel just was spoiling for a fight at the beginning of this story, and that seemed to set the study house over the edge, right? The people wouldn't take it anymore, and there was a complete coup. They deposed their rabbinic leader. And it's not like it was a democracy exactly, but they deposed their rabbinic leader and they picked somebody else to put in his place, a virtual unknown, right? The kid's 18 years old. He doesn't look, he has all the biographical details, but he doesn't have years and years of learning under his belt. Though he's clearly smart, right? They say he's wise and he can handle questions. And this sort of virtual unknown decides to go on day one, goes in a completely different direction, right? He removes the guards and he adds 400, 700 benches and says, everybody come in. It was a totally different model of how the rabbinic academy should run. And they say that when he did that, it became extremely productive, right? I at least this is my take. I'd love to hear what other people say. It became extremely productive. People came in, they started debating, and they made decisions, and they hammered things out, and they taught lots of things. A lot happened. And also, curiously, Rabban Gamliel was right there in the thick of it with them. It didn't actually, they didn't lose him, but he became part of the discussion instead of wielding the power so aggressively. And now all of a sudden, right, we saw this story this exchange between him and Rabbi Yeshua, and Rabbi Yeshua wins the exchange. And Yehuda, the Ammonite convert, I think that was his name, is allowed to enter the congregation of Israel and marry a Jewish woman, right? Things go differently because of that. Does that answer your question, Carol? Did you go back to mute? Okay.
Yes, that helps. Thank you.
Okay. It's a great story. It's one of those that I feel like the longer you study Talmud, you kind of just come back to it. Because it's just, the rabbis don't usually spend that much time on a story and go in that much depth. And it's also a story about themselves, right? So it's really, really interesting. All right, I'm sorry, I'm way over. So I need to let you all go, but I hope you have a wonderful week. I look forward to journeying this week with you further into chapter 7, this grab bag. We are about only 2 weeks from the end of Sota, believe it or not. It's a pretty short tractate, and it becomes more and more diverse in what it covers as we get to the end. So there's lots of good stuff and surprises ahead for us in the next couple of weeks. All right, we will see you tomorrow morning in your inbox and in this space in 1 week time. It was really lovely to see you all. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon. Bye.